In a quiet town where days were predictable and nights were painfully silent, there lived a couple whose love story once felt strong enough to outshine every storm, until the storm finally arrived. Ethan and Livia had spent years building a world together, a world filled with promise, laughter, and dreams whispered in the dark. But somewhere between the chaos of ordinary life and the weight of unspoken expectations, their connection began to crumble. Their conversations turned into arguments, their warm hugs became distant nods, and their dreams slowly turned into questions neither of them had the courage to answer. One cold evening, after weeks of growing distance, Livia walked out, leaving behind only a short note and the scent of her perfume fading through the hallway. Ethan didn't chase her. He didn't call. He didn't speak. Not because he didn't love her, but because he never knew how to fight for someone who was slipping away right in front of him. And Livia didn't stop walking, not because she wanted to leave, but because she wanted him to stop her. Weeks passed in silence, both living separate lives, both pretending they had moved on while carrying 1,000 shattered pieces of the same heart. But destiny has a strange way of pulling broken souls back into the same orbit. One afternoon, a message arrived on Livia's phone, simple, short, and painfully gentle. "I found your favorite book under the couch. I'm keeping it safe until you come home." She read it a dozen times, her eyes stinging with tears, because Ethan wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for hope. That night, without planning, without thinking, she found herself standing outside Ethan's door, her heart trembling like it was remembering how to feel again. When he opened the door, they didn't speak. They didn't cry. They just looked at each other with the kind of softness that only comes from losing something you were never ready to lose. And slowly, like a sunrise pulling night into light, they began talking, really talking, for the first time in months. They spoke about the pain, the misunderstandings, the fears they had buried so deep that even they had forgotten about them. They didn't promise perfection. They didn't promise forever. They only promised honesty, effort, and the courage to choose each other again. Their reconciliation wasn't sudden or magical. It was slow, tender, and real, built from small conversations, quiet forgiveness, and a shared understanding that love isn't about avoiding storms, it's about learning how to hold each other through them. Their story became a testimony of healing, a reminder that sometimes love doesn't need a new beginning, it just needs two people willing to return to the same chapter and write it better. Days turned into weeks, and as Ethan and Livia stepped slowly back into each other's lives, they discovered that healing wasn't a single moment of forgiveness, but a series of small, fragile steps toward trust. Every morning felt like a quiet test. Would they choose love again today, or fall back into old shadows? Ethan began waking up earlier just to prepare Livia's favorite tea, the one with honey and a hint of cinnamon, not because she asked, but because he remembered she always said it made her feel safe. Livia, in return, started leaving tiny handwritten notes around the house, messages like, "Thank you for trying," or "I'm proud of us." These gestures weren't grand, they were gentle reminders that love grows in the places where effort lives. But healing wasn't smooth. One evening, an argument resurfaced from their past, sharp enough to reopen old wounds. Ethan expected Livia to walk away again. Livia expected Ethan to go silent again. But instead, something new happened. Ethan reached for her hand, trembling but steady, and whispered, "Let's talk before this turns into something we can't fix again." And for the first time, Livia didn't run from the conflict. She stayed, breathing through the ache, choosing to build rather than shatter. The conversation was messy, raw, and honest, filled with tears and long pauses, but when it ended, their hearts felt lighter, as if they had finally unclenched a fist they didn't realize they were holding. Slowly, the house that once felt cold began to feel like home again. The couch where Livia cried alone became the place where they shared midnight conversations. The dining table where silence once lived became the place where they laughed about old memories. They began rebuilding traditions: Sunday walks, movie nights, dinners where phones stayed off and eyes stayed connected. And in this quiet rebuilding, they realized something profound. Love wasn't about going back to the beginning. It was about creating a new version of us, one shaped by truth, patience, and resilience. Their story spread through their town like a soft breeze, whispered among friends and shared among hearts that needed hope. People spoke of Ethan and Livia not as the couple who broke apart, but as the couple who dared to return, stronger, softer, and infinitely more real. And without ever intending to, their journey became a testimony for millions, a reminder that even the most fractured relationships can bloom again when two people decide that giving up is not their ending, but their turning point. As the seasons changed, so did Ethan and Livia, quietly, gently, and in ways neither of them expected. Autumn settled over the town like a warm, golden blanket, and with every fallen leaf, they felt pieces of their old pain drifting away. They began discovering each other again, not as the people they used to be, but as the people they were becoming. Ethan started sharing stories he once kept locked inside, fears he had buried so deeply that even he didn't recognize them until they surfaced. Livia listened with a softness that felt like healing, realizing that the man she once thought was distant wasn't cold. He was simply scared of disappointing the person he loved the most. And Livia opened up about the loneliness she carried for years, the kind that even love couldn't fill when left unspoken. Ethan didn't try to solve her pain, he simply held her through it, understanding that sometimes comfort isn't in fixing, but in staying. Together, they built new habits, nightly walks under street lamps, where silence felt comforting instead of heavy, weekly check-ins where they asked each other honestly, "Are we okay?" and small rituals like sharing one good thing about their day, even on the days that felt unbearably heavy. One night, during one of their quiet walks, they passed by the cafe where they had their first date years ago. Livia paused, staring through the fogged glass, as if trying to touch a memory. Ethan looked at her and softly asked, "Do you want to go inside?" She nodded, and they stepped into a space that once held the beginning of everything. Sitting at the same table, sipping the same drinks, they didn't feel like two people trying to rekindle something. They felt like two people rediscovering a flame that had never fully gone out. Livia reached across the table and intertwined her fingers with Ethan's, and in that moment, something powerful shifted, a quiet promise that this time, they weren't going anywhere. Months earlier, this cafe had belonged to their past. Tonight, it belonged to their healing. Their love no longer needed fireworks or dramatic apologies. It thrived in the steady consistency of choosing each other again and again, even when life felt imperfect. And as they walked home that night, hands brushing, hearts steady, both realized that their story wasn't a second chance. It was a completely new chapter, built on truth, courage, and the kind of love that survives storms not because it is unbreakable, but because it learns how to bend. Their journey soon became a whisper of hope for others, a quiet, powerful testimony that broken doesn't mean finished, and sometimes the most beautiful relationships are the ones that rise again, stronger than they ever were before. Winter arrived quietly that year, laying a soft blanket of snow over the town, as if the world itself wanted to give Ethan and Livia a fresh page to write their new story on. With every frosted window and every shimmering streetlight, something inside them felt clearer, calmer, and more certain than ever before. Their relationship, once hanging by a thread, had grown roots again, slow, steady, and deeply grounded in everything they had learned through heartbreak. One particularly cold evening, when the wind howled outside and the air inside felt warm with the scent of cinnamon candles, Livia stumbled upon a box tucked away in the hallway closet. It was filled with old photographs, some from vacations, some from lazy Sundays, others from days they had forgotten ever happened. Slowly, she sat on the floor and spread them around her like fragile pieces of a puzzle that once belonged to another life. Ethan found her there, sitting with the soft glow of the lamp falling across her face, her eyes lingering on a picture of them laughing in the rain years ago. Without a word, he sat beside her. They sifted through the photos together, each picture holding both a memory and a lesson. There were moments of joy, where their smiles were bright and easy. There were moments of exhaustion, where the tiredness in their eyes was louder than their expressions, and there were moments that made them pause, moments that showed exactly where they had begun drifting apart, even though they didn't see it back then. As they shared stories behind the pictures, some painful, some beautiful, they realized something profound. They were not the same people anymore, and that was a good thing. Growth had changed them, softened sharp edges, made them wiser, more tender, more intentional. At one point, Livia held up a picture of the two of them at a festival, Ethan holding her close while she laughed freely. "I miss her," she whispered, not about herself, but about the girl who once believed love would always be easy. Ethan took the picture gently from her hand and said, "She didn't go anywhere, Liv. She just learned how to love in ways she didn't know she would ever need to." His words didn't feel like comfort, they felt like truth. And in that moment, Livia leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder as the snow continued to fall outside, painting the night with quiet magic. They sat there for hours, wrapped in memories, creating a bridge between who they were and who they were becoming. Later that night, when they finally rose from the floor, Ethan paused and said, "Let's make new memories to fill this box. Not perfect ones, just real ones." Livia smiled, a soft, hopeful smile, the kind that only appears when the heart finally understands its own healing. And from that night forward, they consciously created moments, not grand gestures, but tiny pieces of everyday tenderness, cooking together even when the meal burned, dancing in the kitchen at midnight, leaving notes on mirrors, taking long drives with no destination, and laughing at things only they understood. Their love was no longer about surviving storms, it was about building a shelter strong enough for both of them to rest in. Their testimony became more than a story of reconciliation. It became proof that a relationship rebuilt with honesty and tenderness can become even stronger than one built on the illusion of perfection. Ethan and Livia weren't the couple who found their way back by chance. They were the couple who found their way back by choice. And that choice, made again and again, became the foundation of a love that quietly inspired everyone who witnessed it. Spring arrived not with a roar, but with a gentle whisper, soft breezes, blooming flowers, and sunlight that felt warm enough to melt even the coldest memories. For Ethan and Livia, spring didn't just change the world outside, it transformed the world within them. Their home, once filled with tension and quiet sadness, now echoed with small moments of joy that stitched their hearts back together. They began waking up to the sound of laughter instead of silence. Morning coffee became a shared ritual instead of a lonely habit. They talked more, listened more, understood more, not because they were trying to fix something, but because they were choosing to grow something new. One bright morning, they decided to visit the old lake they used to love, a place where they once dreamed about their future. The walk to the lake was peaceful, the trees swaying gently as if greeting them. When they reached the water's edge, Livia felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was the place they had promised forever, before forever became uncertain. She stood quietly, watching ripples form on the water, her heart heavier than her smile. Ethan noticed. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder, holding her the way he used to before everything fell apart. For a moment, neither spoke. The world around them seemed to pause, giving them space to breathe. Livia finally whispered, "I was scared this place would hurt." Ethan replied softly, "Then let's make it safe again." And just like that, they began rewriting the memories of the lake. They sat on the old wooden bench, talking about dreams they had abandoned and new ones they wanted to build. Livia confessed she always wished they had traveled more. Ethan admitted he regretted not celebrating their small victories. They laughed at the silly things they used to fight about, dirty dishes, forgotten texts, mismatched schedules. And as the sun began to set, painting the sky shades of gold and rose, Ethan reached for Livia's hand and said quietly, "Thank you for not giving up on us." Livia squeezed his hand back. "Thank you for learning how to love me better," she replied. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was something deeper, a mutual recognition that love requires courage, humility, and constant effort. While walking back home, Ethan and Livia passed by a small flower shop. Livia paused, staring at the lavender blooms she always loved but never bought for herself. Ethan smiled, walked inside, and returned with a bouquet. "For all the days I forgot to remind you how much you mean to me," he said. Livia's eyes softened with a kind of warmth that can only come from being seen, really seen. From that day on, Ethan brought home a single lavender stem every week. Not because he had to, but because he wanted their love to grow in consistency, not in occasional gestures. Their relationship no longer felt fragile. It felt renewed, rooted in the lessons of their past and shaped by the choices they made each day. People around them noticed the change. Friends felt inspired. Family felt relieved. And strangers who heard their story found hope in places they thought were permanently broken. Ethan and Livia's love was no longer just a story. It was a testimony, one that grew slowly, beautifully, against all odds. A reminder that love doesn't always stay easy, but it becomes extraordinary when two people decide that healing is worth the effort and the person beside them is worth fighting for. Summer arrived with warmth that felt almost symbolic, as if the universe itself was celebrating the quiet rebirth of Ethan and Livia's love. The sunlight poured through their windows each morning, illuminating a home that was once dim with distance, but now glowed with renewed tenderness. They had learned to live slowly, intentionally, savoring small moments instead of chasing perfect ones. One late afternoon, when the sky was painted in soft shades of orange, Livia suggested they visit a small coastal town 2 hours away, somewhere neither of them had been before. It wasn't a planned trip. It was a spontaneous decision born from the desire to create memories outside the walls that had once witnessed their pain. Ethan agreed instantly, and soon they were on the road with the windows down, music playing softly, and a sense of freedom neither had felt in years. The drive was filled with laughter, stolen glances, and the kind of small conversations that make two hearts quietly align. When they reached the coast, the salty breeze seemed to wrap around them like a blessing. They walked barefoot along the shoreline, letting the cold waves wash over their feet. It felt like the ocean was carrying away the last fragments of everything they had once lost. Livia picked up a small seashell, its edges smooth from years of being tossed in the tide. She held it up and said, "This shell survived so much, but look how beautiful it still is." Ethan smiled, understanding her meaning without needing it explained. "Just like us," he whispered. They spent hours exploring the town, sharing ice cream, taking pictures, holding hands like they were rediscovering the sweetness of youth. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, they climbed a rocky hill overlooking the ocean. The wind was strong up there, but comforting. Livia sat down on a flat stone, hugging her knees, while Ethan stood behind her, watching the waves crash against the rocks. After a long, gentle silence, Livia said something she had never told him before. "When we were apart, I used to come to places like this and wish I could rewind time." Ethan knelt beside her, his voice steady. "If we rewound time, we'd lose who we are now. And who we are now is exactly who we needed to become." Livia's eyes filled, not with sadness, but with a deep, overwhelming gratitude, because for the first time, she felt understood in a way she didn't know she had been longing for. They watched the sunset in silence, their shoulders touching, their hearts beating in a soft, steady rhythm that felt like home. When the last sliver of sun disappeared beneath the water, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny wooden charm, a heart carved with the date they first met. Livia gasped, surprised. "I carried this even when we weren't together," he said quietly. "It reminded me that love doesn't vanish, it waits." Livia took the charm in her hands, holding it as if it were made of something sacred. Then she whispered, "And I waited for you to find your way back." They didn't kiss. They didn't cry. They simply held each other as the sky turned to twilight, allowing the moment to speak for them. The drive home was peaceful, filled with the comfortable silence that only exists between two people who trust each other completely. And when they finally reached their doorstep, Ethan turned to Livia and said, "Let's not call this a second chance. Let's call it our real beginning." She nodded, smiling with a softness that felt eternal. That night, as they fell asleep with their hands intertwined, both knew something had irrevocably changed. They were no longer trying to rebuild the past. They were building a future, one defined not by fear or mistakes, but by resilience, honesty, and a love that had learned how to breathe again. Their story, once fractured and fragile, had become a beacon of hope, proof that, even after the deepest heartbreak, love can rise again stronger, braver, and more beautiful than before.